Are you kidding? The subcommittee will come to order. I first want to thank everyone, especially our witnesses, for coming today and being with us, and we look forward to hearing your testimony and offering your insight. After I recognize myself and the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member of this committee for 5 minutes each for opening statements, I will then recognize the members of the subcommittee for 2 minutes each for their opening statements. We will then proceed directly to hear testimony from our distinguished witnesses. The full text of the written testimony will be inserted into the record. Without objection, members may have 5 days to submit statements and questions for the record. After we hear from our witnesses, individual members will be recognized for 5 minutes each for questions of our witnesses. Now I'd like to, my staff has done good work. I would now like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, my dear friend from Florida, Ms. Ileana Ross-Layton, for her remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Mack. Thank you for holding this important hearing to highlight the continued threat to U.S. foreign policy priorities and U.S. national security interests posed by the Castro regime, which is a state sponsor of terrorism operating 90 miles from our U.S. shores. And I'd like to point out and wish him much success that our chairman, Connie Mack, will be appearing at the Heritage Foundation, jointly sponsored by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, tomorrow at 11 to 12:30 to talk about an act of solidarity with the people of Cuba. The struggle for freedom continues. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to thank Ranking Member Engel for his continued support for the freedom and democratic aspirations of the Cuban people. Mr. Engel has had a lifelong record of solidarity with the Cuban people. Even when it is difficult for him politically back home, he errs on the side of freedom, justice, liberty, and respect for human rights. So thank you, Mr. Engel, for the political courage that you show every day. But Mr. Mack, thank you, because the timing for your hearing could not be more appropriate, as it raises grave questions about the administration's policies toward the Castro dictatorship and the threats to our homeland. I'd like to focus in particular on the appalling open-door policy that the administration appears to have adopted for regime officials and operatives. We're talking about agents of a State Department designated state sponsor of terrorism, agents of a regime that seeks to destabilize our democratic partners in our hemisphere, and agents of a dictatorship that has a long-standing alliance with the Iranian regime. We're talking about agents of a regime that has an active espionage operation against the United States, and one of your witnesses, Mr. Simmons, certainly knows about this active espionage operation. It includes members of the WASP network convicted for trying to penetrate U.S. military installations. Also includes cyber attacks in the United States, State Department officials who were turned into spies for the Cuban regime and compromised important U.S. foreign policy information, and an espionage network that included a former senior defense intelligence official who provided highly classified information to the Cuban regime about U.S. military activities, and whose spying may have caused the death of U.S. servicemen operating in Latin America. This is serious stuff indeed. This is a regime responsible for the murder of 3 American citizens and a U.S. resident in 1996 in the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown. So it is incomprehensible and indeed appalling to see the Department of State facilitating access to our nation for these enemies of the United States. From Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, Castro operatives want to travel to the United States, and the State Department will grant them a visa. Just today, earlier today, news reports confirm that state did in fact issue a visa to the daughter of dictator Raul Castro, Mariela Castro, to attend a conference in California next week. Mariela Castro is a communist regime sympathizer. She's part of the regime. She has labeled Cuban dissidents as despicable parasites. Those are her words. There are also reports that Eusebio Leal, tasked by the regime to expand tourism to the island under the guise of serving as a historian of Havana, is also being granted a visa to speak at the Brookings Institute tomorrow, Friday. Just a few weeks ago, Josefina Vidal Ferreiro, a senior official from the regime's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whose husband was expelled from the United States for espionage activities, was also given a warm welcome by the Department of State. This disturbing pattern that is developing, where the doors of the United States are opened to officials and activists from state sponsors of terrorism countries, must not be allowed to continue. 3 of our colleagues and I sent a letter to Secretary Clinton, and it was signed, drafted by our colleague, Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, and signed by the 3 Cuban-American members of Congress, Albio Ceres, David Rivera, and me, saying that this is just inconceivable that such visas and such a wonderful welcome had been given to these individuals. And in that letter, we affirm the intent and the requirements that are in U.S. law that the Secretary of State and the Attorney General are supposed to enforce, and that is a prohibition or a granting on the granting of visas to Cuban regime or Cuban Community Party officials, operatives, or designees. That is the law, and now we're faced with the possibility that the state may seek to thwart congressional oversight over decisions regarding travel by Cuban regime officials. State employees and officials have indicated that they may stop to honoring a commitment. It's been a longstanding agreement with me on behalf of the House Foreign Affairs Committee requiring notification of state actions concerning travel by Cuban regime officials. And this agreement was established in 1997, and it was adopted in lieu of a legislative mandate that I had included in funding legislation, and was honored by successive administrations except for this one. So I strongly urge the Department of State to immediately reverse its course, consider the threats to our nation's security interests posed by the Cuban regime that will be discussed later today, right now, by Congressman Mack's subcommittee. The administration must stop bending over backwards to accommodate the needs, the whims, the request of state sponsors of terrorism that, again, is located just 90 miles from our shores. So thank you, Mr. Mack. Thank you, Mr. Engel, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today, and I thank you for your leadership, sir. And Albio, I had talked about you and discussed the letter that we signed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership, not only obviously with Cuba, but in for our foreign affairs. You are a strong advocate for the ideals of freedom and democracy and the belief in liberty, and so we are very fortunate to have you as the chair of the full committee, and with that, I want to say thank you. And I also, without objection, would like to enter into the record the letter that you mentioned that the 4 of you had authored to Secretary Clinton. So without objection, that'll be included into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And as I begin, let me just say this. It's shocking to me to think that we will give a visa to Raul Castro's daughter and at the same time withhold visas from Hondurans who fought for their constitution and their freedom. I think this just shows how backwards the administration is in its dealings with our friends and allies in Latin America. So on one hand, we allow a visa to a woman that clearly doesn't believe in the ideals of freedom and democracy, but we continue to turn our back and punish those who stood up in Honduras to fight for their freedom, to fight for their democracy, to fight for their constitution. So now let me begin. It's important to note that when it comes to Cuba, there is much more than that meets the eye. This is illustrated by the Cuban doctors who are shipped around the world to provide medical services while spying for the Castro's benefit. Recent assertions the U.S. policy towards Cuba is a relic of the Cold War would indicate that the Castro regime has changed its ways since that time. Today's hearing will reaffirm that it is the same regime operating in Cuba today that was alive and well during the Cold War. Let me be clear. Cuba is no friend of the United States. We are enemy number one. And although Cuba is a small island, it has a global reach that aims to undermine U.S. interests and security through terrorism, intelligence, and irregular warfare. Cuba has built key relationships that help the island expand its reach. Experts have identified that China has, and I quote, developed a special relationship with Cuba for several reasons, ranging from loyalty to intelligence gathering. However, these same experts explain that the public is often kept in the dark on such nefarious activities because officials do not often testify on strategic concerns. Yet the facts remain. The Cuban intelligence service ranks among the very best in the world and continues to engage in espionage operations in the United States. For example, in June 2009, the FBI arrested Kendall Myers, a retired State Department official, and his wife after they spied for the Cuba government for over 3 decades. The DIA analyst, Ana Belén Montes, convicted in 2002 of espionage, provided classified U.S. military information to the Cuban regime. Meanwhile, the harm this has caused to U.S. troops goes unreported. Additionally, Cuban intelligence agents purposely provide false leads worldwide in order to misdirect the U.S. investigations of the September 11th terrorist attacks. We also know that Cuban intelligence strive to create a perception in the United States that Cuba is not a threat, that we should normalize relations. Let's not be fooled. Cuba is an enemy of the United States that has infiltrated our government, steals classified information, traffics information around the world, and counts Iran, Syria, Venezuela, China, and Russia among its best friends. We will never be able to quantify the level of harm Cuba has done against our men and women serving around the world. Despite all of this, the Obama administration is easing travel and remittance restrictions and engaging the Cuban regime. President Obama is giving legitimacy to the Castro model and allowing negotiations to occur on the regime's terms. And once again, the idea that we are going to give a visa to Raul Castro's daughter in this model is just astonishing to me. This is just another example where U.S. foreign policy is backwards in Latin America. The goal of the administration has been reach out to our enemies, turn our back on our friends and allies. And this approach has hurt our national security. The Obama administration has abandoned U.S. citizen Alan Gross in prison while making concessions to a corrupt and lying regime. At the recent Summit of the Americas, where Cuba took center stage, those of us in attendance saw firsthand how the Cuban regime continues to wield its influence. The Cuban people deserve to live in freedom. Once the Castro regime embraces freedom, Cuba can be included in the gathering of free societies. I have repeatedly asked the Castro regime to start with 3 simple actions. First, release political prisoners, including Alan Gross. 2, hold free and fair elections. And 3, permit freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Until the Castro regime can take these 3 steps, there should be no negotiations or talk of normalizing relations with Cuba. There is nothing holding them back but their own actions. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses to shed light on the terrorist activity and irregular warfare engaged by the Castro regime. And I urge everyone to take note of this serious and ongoing threat as the security of the U.S. citizens depends on it. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Engel for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the chair of our full committee, Ileana Ross-Layton, and for her kind words about me. As you know, I take a backseat to no one when it comes to being critical of the Cuban regime. I've been critical of them when I was chairman of this subcommittee for 4 years and as ranking member, both before I was chairman and now after. I've been critical of them. I was critical of them even before I entered Congress. The bottom line for me is if a regime doesn't permit political pluralism or fair and free elections or runs their country with terror, I'm opposed to the regime. I don't care if it's a right-wing dictatorship or a left-wing dictatorship. To me, a dictatorship is despicable. And so I think that the bulk of what you and our chair had to say on Cuba, I certainly agree with it at all. But I must depart from some of the characteristics of the Obama administration. I just came back from the Summit of the Americas with the President, and you, Mr. Chairman, I and others were there. And I saw firsthand the United States being virtually the only country standing up to a lot of these other regimes that want to normalize everything with Cuba, and Cuba doesn't have to do anything to get it. I've seen our administration, Obama administration, demand of the OAS that before Cuba can be admitted, it has to adhere to democratic principles, and Cuba chooses not to do that, so Cuba remains a pariah and is not admitted to the OAS. I saw the President stand up in Cartagena talking about Cuba, what Cuba knows what it needs to do in order to get invites to future summits of the Americas. So I think, and Secretary Clinton as well, I've had many discussions with her, and I think that this administration has stood up in behalf of democracy and has been critical unequivocally of what's going on in Cuba. So I appreciate today's opportunity to discuss the situation in Cuba. When you ask most people in the United States about Latin America, one of the first things that comes to mind is the Castro dictatorship in Cuba. Their oppressive role for the past half-century is undeniable, and I've always argued, as I said before, that dictators from the left should be thought of no differently from dictators on the right. Those who try to romanticize Fidel Castro's rule of Cuba are simply fooling themselves. He's oppressed his people, restricted all forms of expression, locked up all opponents of his rule. And these are basic violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Inter-American Charter. And even though Fidel Castro stepped down from day-to-day leadership of Cuba a few years ago, I think it's become very clear by now that very little has actually changed in Cuba. There clearly remains a profound denial of political pluralism there, while fundamental freedoms are still denied to the Cuban people who cannot speak freely or live their lives outside of the threat of arrest by Cuban security personnel. I support the continued embargo on Cuba, but regardless of where we stand on U.S. policy towards the island, we all want to see democracy in Cuba. Mr. Chairman, you and I, as well as other members of his subcommittee, recently traveled to the Summit of the Americas and was honored to have been able to join President Obama on Air Force One and participate as part of the official U.S. delegation to the summit. As usual with these meetings, Cuba was a major topic on the agenda, and I remain perplexed by some of the countries of the Americas which on the one hand state their commitments to the Inter-American Democratic Charter and on the other hand believe Cuba should rejoin regional meetings and the OAS before it establishes a democratic system and protects human rights. And I say to my friends in the region, I think this is a mistake. It tells the Cuban dictatorship that it need not change to be accepted throughout the hemisphere. We need to be clear with the Castros that only when Cuba comes into compliance with the Charter should it be permitted to rejoin the bodies of the Inter-American system. When I spoke at the OAS several weeks ago, I reiterated much of what I've just said, not only with Cuba, but with Venezuela and Nicaragua and some of the other countries as well. Now, today's hearing is entitled Cuba's Global Network of Terrorism, Intelligence, and Warfare, and I look forward to a testimony of all witnesses. But, Mr. Chairman, I think that this topic doesn't necessarily get to the heart of the questions we need to explore with Cuba. I think the key issues on Cuba are different. I think pressing for democracy, human rights, and a market economy and the choices for our country in a post-Castro Cuba seem to be important for the subcommittee to consider. I know you and I share similar views in that. So I do welcome the opportunity to discuss Cuba. I'm not too worried about their international outreach. I think that during the Cold War, they were much more dangerous than they are today. I don't diminish how dangerous they are, but I would rather concentrate on the utter lack of democracy and the oppression that the Cuban regime forces on its people. And finally, I don't think we should let a moment go by without calling for the release of Alan Gross from prison. Mr. Gross did nothing wrong and should be released at once. Moreover, his health has deteriorated, and if for no other reason, he deserves to be released on humanitarian grounds, something which I think the Castros wouldn't know if it hit them in the head. Mr. Chairman, I have to apologize in advance because I'll have to leave a little early for my hearing, and my good friend Mr. Siris will assume the role of ranking member when I depart. And yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. You know, as you say often, and that I agree, you and I do agree on a lot of things, and I think, not on everything, of course, but on a lot of things, and I think that when it comes to Cuba, we're mostly together, so we appreciate the bipartisanship on this issue with you and others. And the assertion or the interest in another hearing that deals with other issues, we are certainly encouraged and would like to do that as well. And so let's work together on a hearing to do just that, because as you say, there are a lot of important topics when it comes to Cuba. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Siris for 2 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and my colleague, Congressman Engel. We do share many issues and many topics here, and we certainly correlate on a lot of ideas here. Probably, I'll start by saying I'm the only one serving in this Congress who ever lived in Cuba. Came to this country when I was in 1962. I was 11 years old. I still remember very clearly when they took all the books out of the schools and started the indoctrination process. And everything was based on getting rid of America. I remember when they started teaching how to march, and they would march you at the age of 11 and teach you how to take apart and put together a Czechoslovakian machine gun because the Americans were the evil empire. So having had that experience, you know, now I come to Congress and people still think that this is a government that is not a dangerous government, that there's this romanticism with this revolution. This is a dictator. Make no questions about it. This is a dictator that has, over the years, has put spies in this country. We all forget how close we came to nuclear war in 1962. So it's amazing to me how people still have this romantic idea about what the Cuban government is. They are brutal. They don't exercise any control, any human rights, observe any human rights whatsoever. You look at the people that are in prison. I deal with people that are in prison every day in my district. I represent the second largest concentration of Cuban Americans in this country outside of Florida. And many of the political prisoners are living in my district. And I share firsthand with them their experiences, why they were put in jail, why they were given 20 years, who is in jail now, the abuses of human rights. You know, I was also at the summit, and it was very interesting to listen to some of the presidents. But one particular president really opened up my eyes when he said to me, you know, people know what Cuba is, people know what the Castro brothers is, but not of the 35 people who were president, of the 35 presidents who were there, and we met with a lot of them, not one of them would say anything about the Castro, against the Castro brothers. Why? Because they were afraid that the Castro brothers had the tentacles in their countries, and they will stir up the students, they will stir up some of the organizations, and before you know it, they have a problem in their own country. So what do? They keep quiet. And this was told to us by a president of a country. So I'm here to listen to what you have to say. You know, I'm a strong supporter of the embargo. You know, I think the embargo has morphed over the years, and now it's just a matter of putting pressure on Castro so we can have free elections, observe human rights and expressions in Cuba, which has none. But people still, you know, they say this embargo is from the 1960s, from the Russia, Cuba. But it's all right to call it sanctions when we talk about Iran. If we change the name to sanctions in Cuba, I wonder how many people would say something, or what they say now. So I thank you for being here. I thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and I look forward to listening to what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now would like to introduce our witnesses. First, the Honorable Michelle Van Cleve. Ms. Van Cleve served as the National Counterintelligence Executive under President George W. Bush. As the head of the U.S. Counterintelligence, Ms. Van Cleve was responsible for providing strategic direction to and ensuring the integration of counterintelligence activities across the federal government. Currently, Ms. Van Cleve serves as president and co-founder of National Security Concepts, Inc. of Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for being here. Second, Mr. Christopher Simmons is the founding editor of Cuba Confidential, an online blog and source for news on Cuban espionage worldwide. Mr. Simmons is an international authority on the Cuban intelligence service and retired from the Defense Intelligence Agency with over 23 years of experience as a counterintelligence officer. Thank you very much for being here. And now I'd like to recognize Ms. Van Cleve, and you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I have to say it's nice to be back in the Rayburn building. This is where I started my Washington career many years ago, working for then Congressman Jack Kemp, a member of your delegation, Mr. Engel. So it is a pleasure to be here. I do have a written statement for the record, which has been provided to you. It will be ready for inclusion in the record as soon as it's been appropriately cleared by my former employer. I'd like to speak to that for a moment. I did serve, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, as the National Counterintelligence Executive, which is not a position that many people are familiar with. So for one brief moment, let me tell you how that position came about. It was created by the Congress in the Counterintelligence Enhancement Act of 2002 upon the recognition that foreign intelligence services were exploiting seams between the many counterintelligence agencies of the U.S. government, principally the FBI, the CIA, and the military services. The position was created in the wake of the Aldrich Ames espionage case, and it has been a real fascinating and I will say difficult assignment to try to bring strategic coherence to a group of very different agencies with different traditions and missions, and not a real appreciation of what a strategic approach to countering foreign intelligence threats is all about. And that has been the challenge of the office, which now is housed in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Foreign intelligence threats to the United States have grown over the years, and they remain very serious. In fact, one of the largest asymmetries, I might suggest, in the United States' position in the world is our relative vulnerability to espionage, particularly human espionage, because our free and open society is really a paradise, if you will, for foreign spies who will come here to try to acquire information and insights of value to them and to disadvantage us. So dealing with those foreign intelligence threats remains a very important element of U.S. national security and strategy. And I would say that those threats are in fact growing in an era where the United States is properly consumed with concerns over terrorist threats and is involved in wars abroad. Some of our attention is properly diverted to those areas of concern which means that some of the more traditional espionage threats against us may receive less attention than they have in times past. And so in that window of vulnerability, adversaries may see opportunity, and so we see, I would suggest, increases in that threat. Among those increases is the presence of Russian intelligence personnel in the United States and active throughout the world. People do say properly, well, the Cold War is over, things must have changed, and certainly that is true in many dimensions of our relationships with Russia. But one area where that has not changed is the behavior of the Russian intelligence services. Someone forgot to tell them that the Cold War is over, and they're still as active, if not more so, in the United States than they were at the height of the Cold War. Many other intelligence services have gone to school, literally, on the practices of the KGB, and one of their star pupils, of course, was the Cuban Intelligence Service, the DGI. The DGI learned a great deal from the Russians and, in fact, has an advantage in, perhaps over any other service in operating in the United States. Being so close by, having access, having familiarity with our territory, with our people, how things work here, they find it much easier to blend into American society and to score successes against us. Mr. Simmons is going to go into some of those specific activities in more detail, but let me mention one to you in particular. The damage assessment for Ana Montes was accomplished and completed on my watch when I was in office. And I can tell you that she is one of the most damaging spies that the United States has ever found. After 16 years of spying on behalf of Cuba, she compromised everything, virtually everything that we knew about Cuba and how we operated in Cuba and against Cuba. So the Cubans were well aware of everything that we knew about them and could use that to their advantage. In addition, she was able to influence estimates about Cuba and in her conversations with colleagues. And she also found an opportunity to provide information that she acquired to other powers. That is maybe the biggest concern about Cuba, and I will close with this point and invite other questions, which is that to the extent that Cuba is able to be successful against us, the intelligence and insights that they acquire here can be made available in a market, if you will, a marketplace of U.S. secrets. And those secrets are things that go to the heart of what keeps this country free and safe and secure, and our men and women in uniform able to operate in the dangerous places where we send them, and our public here at home safe. So these are very serious matters, and I commend you, Mr. Chairman, and the subcommittee for holding this hearing today and having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so, Mr. Simmons, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your comments.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me today to testify about the threat posed by the Castro regime. I would also like to thank you and the committee for your leadership on this key issue, one that sadly does not get the attention it deserves among the many competing foreign threats and policy priorities. Underestimated and misunderstood for much of the last 53 years, Cuba remains a determined and deadly enemy of the United States. Its military and intelligence services continue their sustained offensive to carry the fight to our doorstep, most often using proxies to mitigate the risk posed by their reckless operations. In many respects, Cuba can be characterized as a violent criminal organization masquerading as a government. The island's 5 intelligence services exist not to protect the nation, but to ensure the survival of the regime. More importantly, from the perspective of today's discussion, several of these services, as well as the Cuban military, operate as profit-making entities. From the trafficking of U.S. secrets to running Cuba's tourism industry, this self-serving and hypocritical capitalism guarantees the continuation of the status quo. The financial livelihood of the mid and senior levels of these organizations is tied to the existence of the regime. By incentivizing espionage, especially when fueled by the Castro brothers' visceral hatred of the United States, Havana has nurtured an organizational culture prone to extraordinarily high-risk endeavors. I will address the most important of these now, beginning with the intelligence threat. Cuba remains the world's sole intelligence trafficker, providing America's adversaries with an endless stream of U.S. secrets collected by its signals intelligence sites, complemented with reporting from traditional human spies. The brokering of this information, which now reportedly generates hundreds of millions of dollars annually, is one of the primary revenue streams sustaining the regime. Cuba's Directorate of Military Intelligence runs one of the largest and most sophisticated SIGINT programs in the world. It collects against a wide range of U.S. government and commercial communications, as well as satellite links between U.S. and Europe. Specific targets are said to be the White House communications, key military communications nodes, NASA, U.S. Air Force communications associated with rocket telemetry, and commercial services dealing in financial and commodities communications. Virtually all U.S. geosynchronous communication satellites are subject to DIM targeting. Cuba's SIGINT efforts are then merged with the robust human intelligence capabilities of its Directorate of Intelligence, the foreign wing of the Ministry of the Interior. At the height of the Cold War, the DI was ranked as the fourth best spy service in the world. Now, more than 20 years after the crippling loss of massive Soviet aid, the DI is still assessed as among the top 6 services in the world. Transitioning to the issue of terrorism, Havana takes a 3-tier approach to its involvement: regime-directed, regime-supported, and finally, alliances with state sponsors. For regime-directed activities, we're looking at specifically bona fide acts of terrorism, Cuban intelligence service targeting of the U.S. war on terror, and active measures. Moving on to regime-supported activities, this focuses on aid to the 40 groups the State Department lists as foreign terrorist organizations. Cuba currently has relations with 4 of those groups: Hezbollah, the Basque Fatherland and Liberty, also known as ETA, and 2 Colombian groups, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia and the National Liberation Army. Regarding state sponsors of terrorism, that definition is self-explanatory, and so I'll continue to move right along. In a written testimony before you, I've captured the most important aspects of the Cuban threat. You may read those details at your leisure. However, I would like to touch on a few issues of the referenced Cuban intelligence missions. First, Cuban intelligence targeting of the U.S. operations in Afghanistan. From April 2006 into the weeks leading up to the death of Osama bin Laden, Cuba's mission embassy in Pakistan was led by one of their premier experts in the targeting of the United States. This officer, who was thrown out of the United States for espionage, is known as Gustavo Ricardo Machin. It is believed that Machin advised the Pakistani government and their intelligence services using information supplied via Havana, the massive SIGINT and human capability we talked about earlier, and provided much needed context to the Pakistanis to help them take their own operations against U.S. counterterrorism missions. It is important to understand when talking about Cuba's collaboration with Pakistan is that the massive penetration of Pakistan's Directorate for Intelligence Services intelligence also makes it almost a certainty that al-Qaeda received information from the Cubans via the Pakistani government. Transitioning to the Cuban intelligence targeting of U.S. operations in Iraq, in late 2002 through early 2003, Havana provided Iraqi intelligence with information on U.S. troop movements and associated military activities. Cuba's high-risk adventurism in this endeavor occurred on the heels of the revelations of American traitor Ana Belén Montez's espionage, including her efforts to kill U.S. and host nation soldiers during a secret war against leftist guerrillas in El Salvador. Moving on to post 9/11, Cuba flooded U.S. embassies with walk-ins claiming to provide intelligence on the terrorism threat. Of the normal 12 walk-ins we expect from the Cubans every year, in the first 6 months, they send in almost 20 walk-ins to tie up U.S. resources. This is a 330% increase in their normal activities. And last but not least of the highlighted issues, I'd like to address Operation Scorpion, which was addressed earlier as a shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue. While this mission on February 24th, 1996, predates the other information I discussed, it is important because this act of terrorism involves the highest levels of the Castro regime. On February 24th, 1996, Cuban MiGs shot down 2 U.S. search and rescue aircraft in international waters. Codenamed Operation Scorpion, it was led by General Eduardo Delgado Rodriguez, the current head of Cuban intelligence. It was personally approved by Fidel Castro and supported by Raul Castro, the current president of Cuba. 4 Americans were murdered in this act of terrorism. Shifting to regime-supported activities, last summer, you were briefed on by Ambassador Noriega on Hezbollah operations in Latin America.
Mr. Simmons, if you could try to wrap it up real quick, and so we can have time for questions.
In conclusion, to conclude, through its intelligence trafficking or own terrorist acts, Cuba has willfully and intentionally murdered Americans in the past, and it will kill again. Furthermore, I believe Havana will covertly facilitate attacks on U.S. personnel, installations, or interests using proxies to create situations in which it cannot be implicated as the sponsor. I also suspect Cuba will continue its efforts to cripple and degrade U.S. counterterrorism operations. The Castro regime sees U.S. inability to respond to its aggression as a sign of weakness. As a result, the threat to our national security has increased because of our failure to act, and our failure to act only emboldens this dangerous dictatorship.
Thank you very much. And before we get to questions, I'd like to have Mr. Rivera 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, before, Mr. Rivera, if I could just, because I have to leave, I have a conflict in another committee, so
Yep.
I again want to leave our side in the able hands of Mr. Cirates, and I want to thank our witnesses for providing extraordinary testimony. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, both of you, for being here for this important hearing. Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I'm often amazed at just how naive we can be with respect to Cuban intelligence, not just by the fact that Cuba, of course, is on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, but just the entire history of the DGI, going back decades and decades. We're seeing in just recent publications by Brian Littell from the University of Miami, how for decades Cuban intelligence has been involved in so many detrimental activities to U.S. interests, from the perhaps from the Kennedy assassination going forward. I can recall just over 20 years ago, even with radio and television Marti, Agent Orion. Remember that case of trying to infiltrate the official U.S. broadcast services for the Cuban people. Of course, the Brothers to the Rescue operation that you spoke about, the entire WASP network, the Ana Belén Montes case, which of course I know, Mr. Simmons, you're very aware of as well. And you see this over and over and over again, and then you see decisions taken, such as allowing Raul Castro's daughter to travel to the United States, and it seems like a continuing pattern of unilateral concessions that only heartens intelligence officers, I would imagine, inside Cuba to continue to try to penetrate U.S. national security interests, which runs a great risk to this nation because of the relationships that Cuba possesses with many enemies of the United States, and the potential for them to continue sharing this intelligence information with those enemies and just augmenting the threat to U.S. national security. So I look forward to our colloquy, our question and answer session. And again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rivera. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And I want to, if I could, I'm going to ask you both the same question, and we'll start with you, Ms. Van Cleve. I said in my opening statement, I talked about that although Cuba is a small island, that it's got a global reach. And I think what's fascinating or concerning to me is that many would believe that there is not a global reach by Cuba. And so I wanted to see, one, if you would agree that there is a global reach with terrorism and intelligence and irregular warfare, and if so, if you could maybe highlight that a little bit, and then I'll also ask Mr. Simmons the same.
Well, yes, Mr. Chairman, I certainly agree with your statement that Cuba has global reach, and there are many reasons for this. But a principal reason is that the activities of concern, which is to say terrorist activities as well as trafficking in foreign in intelligence and national security secrets, are themselves global activities. And what concerns me is that as we see foreign powers move more into the Western Hemisphere, an increasing Chinese presence, for example, in Latin America, certainly Iranian presence in this hemisphere and activities here, and for that matter, perhaps renewed Russian interest in this hemisphere, that the Cubans represent a on-the-ground, highly familiar and capable intelligence service, and that can supply access and insight and support to others who also have interests here in this hemisphere. So it's the nexus of all of those things that gives me pause.
Thank you. Mr. Simmons.
Yes, sir, I would agree with my esteemed colleague regarding Cuba's international reach. I'd like to put it in the context of two different complementary tracks. First being the SIGINT capability we addressed earlier. To intercept your adversary's communications, satellite communications, the only thing necessary is for you to be in a downlink. And Cuba is perfectly located to be in the downlink for all U.S. communications. It is, in fact, the only place outside of Fort Meade in the Western Hemisphere where large-scale interception of communications is possible. This ability makes it a lucrative broker for a lot of our enemies, such as China, which in and of itself is impossible for them to have their own SIGINT facility in this hemisphere. And I would suggest, based on the evidence, that they don't need to because their friends the Cubans run an exceptional operation. Conversely, we have to put it in an economy of scale. The WASP network, which was referred to earlier, involved a Cuban spy operation based in South Florida, but extending all the way to New York City and as far west as Louisiana, and then also supported by Mexico. It involved over approximately 42 officers and agents, and its operating budget was $30,000 a year. I would suggest to you there are probably no other intelligence services that can run intelligence operations on the cheap as well as the Cubans can.
Thank you. I want to get to this issue because a couple times we've talked about how the Castro regime it's a profit-making center for them. And I wondered if Mr. Simmons, if you wanted to talk to that. I believe you said hundreds of millions of dollars that they're making as a profit. And do you, in your opinion, do you think that is something that can be disrupted?
Yes, sir. Several years ago, shortly, we believe after the end of Soviet subsidies, the Castro brothers turned over the tourism sector to military and intelligence services. And now it is run as just that, a profit-making center. And we know from defectors that these services are actually allowed to take earnings and recycle it into their own budgets. So they are further incentivized in what they do. When you look at the tourism industry, virtually every facet, from a visitor applying for the visa to arriving in Cuba on a Cuban airline, to the Hotel Nacional and other hotels, it funds nothing but the Cuban intelligence services and military and the regime's ability to repress its own people. It also, because of the structure, puts virtually every tourist in front of the intelligence services for assessment as future agents. I believe that the tourism aspect could be crippled greatly by changing the rules of the game. The Cubans have no respect for America, never have, and you see that in the way their intelligence services operate. And so taking the ability to profit off of tourism would not only significantly hurt the intelligence services, but it would have a ripple effect on the government's ability to repress its own people.
Thank you. My time has expired. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Sears for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, how can anybody respect us when we take Cuba so lightly? And that is, you know, they think they can do anything they want. How many criminals are there in Cuba now, approximately? Somebody told me over 100, including from New Jersey, Joanne Chesimard, who killed a state trooper. Would you have an idea that are seeking sanctions in Cuba currently? Is that your figure also? Because I know that in New Jersey, the New Jersey troopers, they have a $1 million reward for Joanne Chesimard for killing one of their state troopers on a highway, and she fled to Cuba as she was being processed. You know, everybody in Washington is concerned about cyber warfare. And I was just wondering do you think Cuba is receiving any assistance from other countries to establish and develop cyber war capabilities against us?
Well, Mr. Sears, I don't have specific information on that, but I am happy to speculate. And on the basis of my understanding of how the extent of cooperation among intelligence services of concern to the United States, I would be very surprised if there wasn't cooperation in the arena of cyber exploitation. So I think one should assume that that kind of information exchange and assistance, in fact, takes place.
Mr. Simmons, would you care to comment?
Yes, sir. Just to add one specific example, again, transitioning to signals intelligence, by and large, if you're able to intercept communications of any sort, you're also able to jam the very same communications or signals. And in July 2003, acting on behalf of Iran, Cuban intelligence jammed the transmissions of the national Iranian television, Voice of America, and 3 other Iran-bound broadcast systems. The timing of the jamming coincided with Tehran's crackdown on dissident commemoration of the historic 1999 student uprising. L'Oreal Skynet, who owned the targeted satellite, was quickly able to identify the source of the jamming to a spot several miles outside of Havana, subsequently identified as the Cuban military intelligence base at Bejucal, head of their SIGINT program. They then tried to relocate, well, prior to Cuba broadcast jamming the system, the Iranians had jammed a different platform from a geosynchronous satellite over Europe. And when that was shut down, that's when they moved to the U.S. communications, and their Cuban allies were able to shut down those 4 programs. So yes, sir, they can do it at will, and in that instance, we know for a fact it was requested by Tehran.
Did you say the town of Bejucal?
Say-
What's the name of the town, Bejucal?
Yes, sir.
That's where I was born. You know, as a young boy, I remember then not being able to go to this hill because there was a lot of construction. So everybody assumed that there was something going on because they basically gutted the mountain. Not a mountain, but it's and we could see the work actually being done from the town that I lived in. And obviously it was all fenced off. Kids couldn't go up there like we used to go. So now you're telling me that there is a station there that's a communication center?
Yes, sir. Those fields now grow satellite dishes.
Right. You know, this relationship with Iran fascinates me because you couldn't have two more different countries, but yet there's one common ground, and that is destroy America. So I was just wondering if you can expand on that relationship with Iran and in Cuba, and what are their plans, not what are the plans, but obviously they want to extend to the rest of Central America and South America their influence. So can you speak a little bit about that relationship?
Yes, sir. In many respects, Cuban foreign policy and the influence of the intelligence services can be viewed as very pragmatic. And I say that in the sense that when it comes to Iran, the Castro brothers embrace the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The relations with Iran actually go back to the earliest days of the Iranian Revolution. Approximately half of the Cuban ambassadors who have served in Iran have been intelligence officers. Most recently, for about the last 20 years, there's been a huge increase in Cuban-Iranian cooperation in biomedical technologies. As you're aware, Cuba currently holds over 400 patents in this arena, many jointly with the Iranians, and the field of biomedicine is one of those that what is medicine today can be a terrorist threat tomorrow. So yes, sir, when it comes to a mutual enemy, we are their mutual enemy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now recognize Mr. Rivera for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin referencing what I mentioned earlier in terms of the Ana Belén Montes case. And I'm wondering, for both of you, but particularly Mr. Simmons, if you believe that the DGI penetration of Defense Intelligence Agency or National Security Agency and all the different intelligence agencies that Ana Belén Montes was engaged with, if that penetration ended with Ana Belén Montes.
Mr. Rivera, allow me to begin, and I know that Mr. Simmons will have more to offer on this point. Montes damage assessment was something that I oversaw when I was in office as the National Counterintelligence Executive. And that damage assessment took several years to compile. We learned a great deal about what she had compromised. Damage assessment itself remains highly classified. But among the things that she was able to provide to the Cubans was insight into activities of very high national security sensitivity that were of little use to the Cubans, but perhaps of much greater use to other powers. And what the tradecraft of how the Cubans ran her was interesting too, in that she was able to do a lot of her reporting in meets with Cubans here in Washington, D.C. Over a period of 16 years. That's astounding that they're able to operate that freely and, I would suggest, openly against American society. So what she did and the extent of her harm to the United States was enormous, but perhaps most disturbing. How is it that they were able to recruit her so successfully and penetrate the highest reaches of our Cuban analytic community so well?
But my understanding is that,
And so I'm going to get to your punchline.
yeah, but as far as her sentencing, my understanding is she cooperated.
She did.
Okay, so if she cooperated, then I'm wondering just how much did she cooperate? Did it lead to any other intelligence breaches? Are we done with intelligence breaches now that we were done with Ana Belén Montes?
Oh, not even close. Now, her cooperation, her plea agreement, as is often the case with major spies, was done in order that we might gain understanding of what it is that she compromised and how that was done. So we did get a great deal from her about that, but my punchline to you is that it is so, the Cubans are so successful in going against the U.S. government and have been able to do that for such a sustained number of years that there is no reason to believe at all that Montez, or for that matter, the Myers team at the State Department, are the last. They are simply the last, and they are the most recent that we have been able to talk about publicly.
And do you think we're trying to ferret out whatever remnants there may be post-Myers, post-Montes?
I know we are.
Mr. Simmons, you want to add anything?
Yes, sir, very quickly. Based on 53 years of Cuban intelligence protocols, it would be an anomaly for them to have only run one penetration of the Defense Intelligence Agency. According to their own doctrine, there should be 3 penetrations of the agency. The logic behind that is Cubans are very hesitant to run singleton operations because there's no way to have feedback on the success or veracity of the information being provided by the agent. In an organization like DIA, they would not run 3 analysts because then they're going to get redundant reporting. They would look at somebody like Montez, use her to report on the analytic realm, and then penetrate other sectors of the agency. Done correctly, all 3 agents would end up reporting on one another without the awareness that the others are actually agents. That, according to the Cuban doctrine, is the perfect way to run an agent operation. So yes, sir, there should be 2 more, at least 2 more penetrations of DIA. The Cubans have had decades to do it, so it should not be a surprise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and if the witnesses don't mind, we'd like to, I've got a few more questions, and I'm sure that my colleagues may have other questions too. So I want to talk a little bit with you, Ms. Van Cleve, about policy and why haven't we done a better job, and what kind of recommendations would you have for us, for this committee, as we look at how to deal with the problem with Cuba?
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Chairman. I believe that our vulnerabilities to Cuban espionage and indeed to other hostile intelligence services is a very serious national security matter, and that a major reason why we've had such losses to espionage in decades past is the way that counterintelligence grew up in the United States. It began and grew out of the inherent missions of the several agencies that execute counterintelligence. The FBI is responsible for enforcing our espionage laws within the U.S. The CIA is responsible for counterintelligence to the extent that it needs to protect its own human collection missions abroad. And the military services also have their own counterintelligence elements that are responsible for force protection to look after their ability to execute their operations plans and be secure abroad. But what we haven't had historically is any entity in the United States that sits back and says, what are the foreign intelligence threats to the United States, and what are we going to do about those threats? So I bring that down to the level of Cuba, and I say, here you've got a very aggressive, capable, and successful intelligence service directed against us. It has been our practice to deal with these threats, these penetrations, these spies, on a case-by-case basis as they show up here in the United States. What we haven't done is we have not had a strategic look at what should we do as a nation about the threat that Cuban intelligence represents the United States and our interests in this hemisphere and elsewhere in the world. We do not have a strategic counterintelligence program to try to assess and degrade their capabilities against us, and that is true with respect to Cuba and every other foreign intelligence service that may be of concern. So from a policy perspective, I have to say that this hearing is fascinating to me because it is so infrequently the case I'm sorry to say, that the intelligence threat presented by regional actors is factored into policy discussions. Maybe one reason is because understanding that threat and what they're doing is usually so very highly classified, so much of it is difficult to discuss. But another reason is it seems that our national security policy community, by and large, is either is unfamiliar with or not persuaded by the danger that these intelligence activities present to the United States. And so I commend you and the subcommittee for taking on this question very seriously, and would also urge you in your reports or any forward action that you might have to include as a question how we might not do a better job from a counterintelligence perspective in dealing with these threats as part of a larger U.S. policy and strategy toward Cuba.
Thank you very much. Mr. Simmons, do you have some sort of guidance that you could give the committee?
Yes, sir. My guidance would be much more tactical in nature, if you will. In dealing with the Castro brothers, we need to bear in mind that dictators understand one thing, and that's power. And so a surgical countermeasure to Cuban offenses is the best practice. An example that comes to mind is going back to the 2003 Cuban intelligence targeting of Iraqi freedom. That May, we expelled 14 Cuban diplomats, all of whom were intelligence officers. Of the 14, 2 were husband-wife teams, so we actually threw out 16 spies, which removed about a third of their intelligence presence, serving under diplomatic cover, and a crippled Cuban intelligence operations in the United States for about 18 months to 2 years. Cubans understand focused surgical, or I should say the Castro regime understands focused surgical countermeasures like that. And I would suggest that be used as a model to protect U.S. interests in the future.
Thank you. It sounds to me that both are good ideas. And that, you know, one of the things I think we want to try to do in this committee is begin to push the envelope a little bit on what we can do, what kind of policy positions that we can take to understand better and to disrupt what's happening in Cuba and elsewhere, frankly, but for the purview of this committee in Cuba. Mr. Sears, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. You know, last week, I think it was Wolf Blitzer. He had an interview with one of the foreign ministers in Cuba, and all of a sudden, Alan Gross now they're getting ready to talk about releasing Alan Gross. I just wondering, what do you think that's all about? All of a sudden now, after they have this poor man in jail, now they're saying that there possibly could be some talks to release him and talk about other things. What do you think that's about? I mean, obviously, you know, many people here are concerned that there will be a swap, you know, for Alan Gross. And we obviously all against it. But I was just wondering, what's your reaction to a move like that all of a sudden? Because they don't make a move unless they think 5 moves ahead. So I was just wondering if you can surmise what they might be thinking.
Yes, sir. I've maintained from the start that Alan Gross was grabbed and imprisoned for no reason other than to be used as a pawn in a future spy trade. That was my position when interviewed by the Miami Herald several days after he was initially imprisoned. My position has not changed. When we look at the CNN interview you referenced with Josefina Vidal, who was thrown out of the United States for espionage activities, you may recall that in recent discussions, actually in the initial discussions regarding access to Alan Gross and a subsequent trade, the head of the North American division, Josefina Vidal, her deputy, and the consular officer handling the Alan Gross situation were all intelligence officers thrown out of the United States. This has, from its very inception, had nothing to do with Alan Gross's activities. He was simply in the wrong place at the right time, and the Cubans need leverage. Based on their disrespect for the United States, I believe that they've always known or believed that at some point the U.S. would relent and trade for an American, because that's what we've always done in the past. They have no reason to think we won't do the same thing now.
You know, it's amazing to me, this information that you have, that she was thrown out of this country for spying, Josephine Vidal, and I don't ever remember hearing anybody mentioning that when this interview was going on. It's just like we have in this country the shortest memory of anything. I mean, about everything. Why doesn't somebody mention when they're doing this interview that this is a former spy that was spy that was chased out of this country, and she's all of a sudden now representing that the Cuban government wants somehow to deal. It's just unfortunate. You know. Thank you. Do you have any comments on that issue?
I will confess that I was thinking while you were asking the question that, gee, I wish that we had a definitive answer to exactly what it was they planned to do. And the only way you can have a definitive answer to that is if you've got good intelligence on Cuban discussions and planning and thinking. And I come back to the need to have increased resources going into our intelligence collection directed against the Cubans.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rivera, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've mentioned a few times in the hearing the fact that Cuba is on the list, the State Department's list of official sponsors of terrorism. And I wonder if I could get your opinions regarding intelligence activity either being the sole purview of nation states, or perhaps also activity that other actors engage in, such as terrorist organizations. And so I wonder how many of the terrorist groups or terrorist organizations with which Cuba cooperates, or perhaps activities on the island or off the island, but nexus with Cuba. How many of those organizations also engage in intelligence activity against the United States? I'll start with Ms. Van Cleve.
Well, Congressman, you are quite right that traditional kinds of intelligence activities are practiced by many terrorist organizations throughout the world precisely for the purpose of being able to gain the access, the insights, the information that they need to be successful in those terrorist operations. So we have a very careful counterintelligence dimension to U.S. counterterrorism activities, for example. Cuban involvement with terrorist groups, I would say, would be useful, potentially, to those terrorist groups, depending on the kinds of insights that they were looking for and what they were planning to do. I was struck by our conversation earlier about Iran, which of course itself is a state sponsor of terror, but Iran itself trying to carry out a terrorist operation here in the United States, you recall recently fielded through apparently a Mexican drug cartel assassination team to try to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States at a restaurant in Georgetown, where you've probably been, I've been. And it's amazing that Iran would escalate its aggressive actions and be so bold and brazen to come right into the U.S. and foster that kind of an activity. Well, they don't have the insights within the United States, the ground expertise to carry that out. They need some help from an organization, from an entity, from people who do know the territory here.
And that's where the organizations may come in?
They turn to a Mexican drug cartel, but you can speculate about how that kind of activity, it's an example, if you will, of how local expertise can be valuable to others.
Well, so organizations such as whether it be ETA or FARC or Hezbollah or Hamas, those types of organizations with which the Castro dictatorship maintains relationships, what is the activity or intelligence activity against the United States from organizations like ETA or FARC or Hezbollah or Hamas?
Well, certainly those organizations carry out terrorist operations against friends and allies of the United States and could find it very useful, may have themselves need for insight into specific national defense information, our relations, interactions, knowledge of activities that would be of value to them as they carry out their terrorist operations. I am spinning a web that suggests that espionage is a very complex business and that the specific things that may be targeted by a source, an asset inside the U.S. government that might be funneled through the DGI, for example, to another customer, if you will, abroad, provide a rich playing field of possibilities.
Mr. Simmons, you want to add anything with the 30 seconds we have left?
Yes, so just very quickly, terrorist groups are evolving animals, much like other entities. Cuba has historically been tied to well over 40 different terrorist groups since the 1960s, and their basic protocol is to provide them intelligence training first, let them get on their feet so they can begin conducting their own operations, and then once they're successful, migrate over to bilateral operations within their own lane of the road, if you will. So in essence, it allows Cuba to conduct intelligence operations by proxy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Smith, you recognized for 5 minutes for questions, and you're batting cleanup.
Thank you. Well, I apologize, Mr. Chairman, for being late, and I thank you for calling this very important and very often under-focused upon problem as it relates to Cuba. We do focus, as we ought to, you and all of us on this committee, on the human rights part, which is absolutely a priority, but the intelligence and the terror networks and all of that collaboration, I applaud you for doing that. I was late because I had a hearing of my own on Ukraine and the continued incarceration of the former Prime Minister Timoshenko. So that's why I'm late, but I don't have any questions, but you want to, okay. Again, I want to thank you. I look forward to reading your testimony, and I apologize for being late.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses, and you know, my takeaway is we have so much more to learn as a committee on what we should be looking at from policy position on espionage and counterintelligence in Cuba, and frankly, it sounds like not just in Cuba, but many other places. And one of the things that Ms. Van Cleve, you mentioned about, you talked about Iranian working with the drug cartels. You know, I and this committee are very concerned about the evolving nature of the drug cartels into these are my words that aren't necessarily make people happy, but into an insurgency, and that they're being used by other terrorist organizations to affect not only Mexico, but the United States and other parts of Latin America. So I want to thank both of you, Mr. Simmons, Ms. Van Cleve, for being here today, for your insight, and we look forward to continuing to learn more and try to come up with some way to address this problem. So thank you very much, and the meeting is adjourned. Yep, sorry. Mr.
I also want to thank you, but I also want to thank the chairman for holding this hearing. You know, this is a topic that is not often spoken about here on the Hill, and he's right on target to be concerned. So I want to thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you very much. I'll always accept thanks. The meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.